And this is BBC Breakfast. More than 3 million people have already left Syria as a result of the fighting, and for those left behind in areas of conflict, life is difficult and dangerous.
How do Syrians here in the UK feel about the potential airstrikes against Islamic State fighters in their country? With us this morning is Yasmine Nahalwi, who works with the Syrian community here. Good morning.
Morning.
And your family comes from Syria originally.
Yep.
What do you feel, and how do people in your community feel about the prospect of British fighters conducting airstrikes over Syria?
Well, this campaign has been ongoing for a year in Syria. So the American-led coalition has been targeting ISIS in Syria for the past year, and we don't have any results to show for it. And for us, that's indicative of a flawed strategy, and we very much know that it's a flawed strategy. For us as Syrians, we see the primary issue in Syria to be the Assad regime. The Assad regime since 2011 has been murderous, has been barbaric, has put violence, chaos and destruction on the ground in Syria, and has created the very violence and radicalization on the ground. And we're saying if you really want to get rid of radicalization and the threat that radicalization poses to the UK, we have to start with the root cause of the conflict in Syria, which is the Assad regime.
So what do you think should be the step forward? Are you talking about diplomacy?
Well, we ultimately do want a political solution, but what we've seen in Syria is that the political solutions have never worked unless they were backed by military threats. So, for example, the only time that the Assad regime actually enforced negotiations was in 2013 after he used chemical weapons and the West threatened to intervene. And that was the one time where he actually sat at the negotiating table and enforced what was decided. Other than that, all the political negotiations have failed. So what we're saying is, yes, we want a political solution, but this has to be backed by a threat of credible military force through a no-bombing zone, which will not entail boots on the ground. It will not entail flights over Syrian airspace necessarily, but it has to be backed with some sort of credible threat in order for it to work.
Right. Islamic State, so-called, operates without borders through several different countries, principally in Syria. So why would getting rid of President Assad deal with that particular threat? Well,
we know that for anything to work against ISIS, we know that we need ground troops. And this is something that is not disputed. And what we're saying in Syria is we're currently lacking the ground troops that are willing to fight with us, because right now they're focused on their primary enemy, which is the Assad regime. The moderate opposition has been fighting ISIS for a long time, and they're very united in fighting ISIS. But the problem is that when they do so, they're being bombed from the sky by the Assad regime. So if we do get rid of that threat that the bombing poses on civilians from the regime, then that frees up the moderate opposition to themselves take on ISIS in Syria. ISIS is not a Syrian organization. It's not an ideology that we share or that we have.
OK, let's just talk a little bit about what ISIS might be doing on the ground as well, because there are reports that they may be hiding within the civilian population. What do you know? What have people told you?
There's no set kind of targets for ISIS. They are very much, as you said, within civilian populated areas. Now, we know that any targeting will try to minimize civilian casualties, but can we really guarantee this at the end of the day? And we've seen just from bombing by other countries that this is not the case. Well, most particularly Russia has been targeting not even ISIS areas where ISIS is. They're targeting civilian areas, targeting hospitals. Now, we are very concerned about that, obviously.
You talked about having a military presence on the ground to get rid of President Assad, but whose military presence should that be?
Well, there are moderate forces on the ground in Syria. There have been for quite a long time. And we do need to offer more support for these groups. They're being fought by Assad on one hand, they're being fought by Russia on the other hand, they're being fought by ISIS. So when you look at all these different factors, they're there, and they're doing a great job with what they have, but at least the minimum that they need is the cover from the air.
When you hear that the United States is sending in more special forces, does that encourage you?
Well, at the end of the day, this is going to have to be Syrian-led. And when the U.S. sends in its special forces, we have to ask, for what? For example, the U.S.'s Train and Equip program was training Syrian fighters to fight ISIS, forgetting that, again, their primary enemy at this point is the Assad regime. The primary threat to them and to their families and to their people is from the Assad regime. So when you're coming in, you're training fighters and you're telling them you can only target ISIS and you can't target the Assad regime, that's going to fail, and that's why it did fail.
All right. Yasmine Nahalwi, thanks very much.
Thank you.
6:45 exactly. This is Breakfast from BBC.